Margaret Chen had always been the type of neighbor who minded her own business. At 62, she lived alone in her modest two-story house on Maple Street, spending her days tending to her prized garden and reading mystery novels on her front porch. Her property was her sanctuary, carefully maintained with flower beds that bloomed in perfect succession throughout the seasons, and a vegetable garden that supplied her kitchen. Year-round, the trouble began on a crisp October morning when Margaret noticed something odd. Her prize-winning roses, which she had been nurturing for the upcoming garden club competition, appeared disturbed. Several stems were broken, and there were clear footprints in the soft soil around the flower bed. At first, she assumed it might have been a stray dog, or perhaps the neighborhood raccoons that occasionally wandered through yards looking for food. But the next morning brought more evidence of an unwelcome visitor. This time, tomatoes were missing from her vegetable patch, and someone had clearly walked through her herb garden, crushing her delicate basil plants. Margaret felt a surge of frustration mixed with confusion. Who would do such a thing, and why? She decided to ask her neighbor, James Morrison, if he had noticed anything unusual. James was a practical man in his late 40s who worked as an engineer and lived in the house directly adjacent to Margaret's property. He had moved to the neighborhood 3 years earlier after his divorce and generally kept to himself, though he had always been polite and helpful when needed. When Margaret knocked on his door that evening, James listened carefully to her concerns. He admitted he hadn't seen anyone suspicious, but he offered to keep an eye out. What he didn't tell Margaret was that he had actually noticed someone in her yard the previous week, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. The person had moved quickly and quietly, almost like they belonged there. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. Margaret's garden hose was moved from where she always kept it coiled neatly by her back door. Her garden tools, which she stored in a small shed, were rearranged. Most concerning of all, she found muddy footprints on her back porch and realized someone had been peering through her kitchen window. The prints were distinctly from women's shoes based on the narrow heel marks in the dried mud. Margaret began to feel genuinely unsettled. She started locking her doors during the day, something she had never felt the need to do in this quiet neighborhood. She called the local police, but without any real damage or theft. There wasn't much they could do beyond taking a report and promising to increase patrols in the area. The mystery deepened when Margaret discovered that other items were going missing. Small things at first: a decorative garden gnome, a wind chime from her porch, and a pair of gardening gloves she had left on her outdoor table. But then larger items began disappearing. Her outdoor cushions vanished overnight, and her birdbath was moved to a completely different location in her yard. James noticed that Margaret seemed increasingly stressed and offered to install some motion sensor lights around her property. As he worked on the installation, he confided that he had also experienced some strange incidents. His trash cans had been moved, and he was certain someone had been on his property as well, though nothing valuable had been taken. The situation took a more serious turn when Margaret woke up one morning to find her back door slightly ajar. She was absolutely certain she had locked it the night before. Her heart racing, she carefully walked through her house, checking each room. Nothing appeared to be missing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside her home. That afternoon, Margaret made an important discovery. While working in her garden, she noticed a pattern to the disturbances. The footprints always led from the same direction, through a gap in the hedge that separated her property from the abandoned lot behind her house. The lot had been empty for years, overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris from an old house that had been torn down. As Margaret examined the area more closely, she found evidence of a makeshift path through the tall grass and weeds. Someone had been using this route regularly, creating a worn trail that led directly to her backyard. The discovery both relieved and frightened her. At least now she knew how the intruder was accessing her property. But it also meant this wasn't random. Someone was deliberately and repeatedly targeting her home. That evening, Margaret sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the shadows grow longer across her yard. She had lived in this house for over 20 years and had never felt unsafe. Now every rustle of leaves made her jump, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. She wondered who could be doing this and why they had chosen her. Little did she know that the answer would be more shocking than anything she could have imagined. James Morrison had been watching Margaret's growing distress with increasing concern. As an engineer, his mind naturally turned to technical solutions for problems, and Margaret's mysterious intruder presented a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. After installing the motion sensor lights, he began to consider more sophisticated approaches to catching whoever was terrorizing his neighbor. The breakthrough came when James remembered the security camera system he had purchased, but never installed after his divorce. The cameras were still in their boxes in his garage, originally bought to monitor his previous home during the messy separation from his ex-wife. Now they seemed perfect for a different kind of surveillance operation. James approached Margaret with his idea during one of their increasingly frequent conversations about the ongoing incidents. Margaret was initially hesitant about having cameras pointed toward her property, worried about her own privacy. But when James explained that he could position them to monitor only the areas where the intruder had been active, she agreed it was their best option. Working together, they developed a strategic plan. James would install cameras at 3 key locations, one focused on the gap in the hedge where the intruder entered, another covering Margaret's backyard where most of the disturbances occurred, and a third monitoring her back porch and door. The cameras were equipped with night vision and motion detection, and James set them up to record continuously and send alerts to his phone whenever movement was detected. The first few nights after the installation were quiet, leading Margaret to hope that perhaps the mere presence of the cameras had scared off the intruder. James wasn't so optimistic. In his experience, people who engaged in this type of behavior were often driven by compulsions that wouldn't be easily deterred by security measures alone. His intuition proved correct on the 4th night. At exactly 2:47 a.m., James's phone buzzed with multiple motion alerts. Grabbing his laptop, he quickly accessed the camera feeds and felt his blood run cold at what he saw. The figure moving through Margaret's yard wasn't a stranger at all. The cameras clearly captured a woman in her mid-30s with shoulder-length dark hair, wearing jeans and a dark hoodie. She moved through the yard with obvious familiarity, heading directly to Margaret's herb garden where she began carefully harvesting basil and rosemary. Her movements were methodical and purposeful, suggesting this wasn't her first visit. But it was when the woman looked up toward Margaret's kitchen window that James felt a shock of recognition. The face illuminated by the motion sensor light belonged to someone he knew all too well, his ex-wife, Linda Morrison. James sat in stunned silence, watching as Linda continued her nocturnal activities in Margaret's yard. She moved to the flower beds next, cutting several roses with small scissors she produced from her pocket. Then she walked to Margaret's back porch where she sat down on the steps and simply stared at the house for nearly 10 minutes. The implications hit James like a physical blow. Linda lived over 50 miles away in another city. For her to be here, repeatedly trespassing on Margaret's property, meant she had been making regular trips specifically for this purpose. But why Margaret's house? And how long had this been going on? As James continued watching the footage, Linda's behavior became even more disturbing. She tried the handle of Margaret's back door, checking to see if it was locked. When she found it secure, she walked around the house, testing windows. The realization that she had been inside Margaret's home on the morning Margaret found her door ajar sent a chill down James's spine. Finally, after nearly an hour on the property, Linda gathered the items she had taken and disappeared back through the hedge gap. James immediately saved all the camera footage and spent the rest of the night trying to process what he had discovered. The next morning, James faced a difficult decision. He needed to tell Margaret what he had learned, but he dreaded revealing that his own ex-wife was responsible for her torment. He also wasn't sure how to explain Linda's motivation, since he couldn't understand it himself. When he knocked on Margaret's door with his laptop in hand, she immediately knew from his expression that he had discovered something significant. They sat at her kitchen table as James showed her the footage, watching Margaret's face change from curiosity to confusion to genuine fear as she realized the deliberate nature of the intrusions. Margaret's first question was the same one that had been haunting James all night. Why is she doing this to me? James had to admit he had no idea. During their marriage, Linda had never shown any particular interest in gardening or their neighbors. She had never mentioned Margaret specifically, and as far as he knew, the two women had never even met. The footage revealed that Linda's behavior went beyond simple trespassing or petty theft. Her actions suggested an obsession with Margaret's life and property. The way she sat on the porch staring at the house, indicated she was deriving some kind of satisfaction or comfort from being in Margaret's space. Margaret listened to James's explanation with growing alarm. The idea that someone she didn't know had been systematically invading her privacy and property was frightening enough. Learning that this person was connected to her neighbor, someone she had come to trust and rely on during this ordeal, added another layer of violation to her experience. James assured Margaret that he would handle the situation, but she insisted they should involve the police immediately. Now they had clear evidence of repeated trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, and theft. More importantly, they had identified the perpetrator, which meant the authorities could take concrete action. As they prepared to contact the police, both James and Margaret wondered what had driven Linda to target Margaret so specifically. The answer to that question would prove to be more complex and disturbing than either of them could have imagined. Detective Sarah Williams had seen many unusual cases during her 15 years with the local police department, but the situation James and Margaret presented was among the strangest. The evidence was clear and compelling. The camera footage showed repeated trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, and theft. What made it particularly unusual was the apparent randomness of the target and the methodical nature of the crimes. After reviewing the footage and taking detailed statements from both James and Margaret, Detective Williams explained that while they had strong evidence for criminal charges, the case raised several red flags that suggested Linda Morrison might be dealing with mental health issues. The obsessive behavior, the long drives from another city, and the seemingly purposeless nature of many of her actions pointed to something beyond simple criminal intent. James found himself in an extremely uncomfortable position. When Detective Williams asked about his relationship with Linda and whether he had any insight into her possible motivations, he had to admit that their divorce had been contentious. Linda had accused him of having an affair, which wasn't true and had become increasingly paranoid and irrational in the months leading up to their separation. What James hadn't shared with Margaret or the detective was that Linda had been calling him periodically over the past year, usually late at night and often incoherent. She would ramble about feeling betrayed and abandoned, sometimes accusing him of deliberately trying to ruin her life. He had assumed these calls were just the unfortunate aftermath of a difficult divorce and had stopped answering them months ago. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, James began to see a possible connection. During one of Linda's more lucid phone calls, she had specifically mentioned seeing him talking to that woman next door, and had demanded to know who she was. At the time, James had dismissed it as jealousy and paranoia, explaining that Margaret was simply a neighbor and nothing more. Detective Williams suggested that Linda might have developed a fixation on Margaret as a symbol of James's new life without her. In Linda's distorted thinking, Margaret might represent everything she felt she had lost: a peaceful home, a stable neighborhood, a life of simple pleasures like gardening and quiet evenings. The detective also revealed that when she contacted Linda's local police department, she learned that Linda had been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior in her own community. She had been fired from her job as a dental hygienist 3 months earlier for missing work and displaying unpredictable mood swings. Her landlord had also filed a complaint about her disturbing other tenants with loud music and arguments with unseen people. Margaret listened to these revelations with a mixture of sympathy and continued fear. While she could understand that Linda might be struggling with mental health issues, the knowledge that she had been specifically targeted because of her connection to James made her feel even more vulnerable. She worried that Linda's obsession might escalate if she felt cornered or threatened by legal action. Detective Williams assured them that she would coordinate with authorities in Linda's city to conduct a welfare check and potentially arrange for a mental health evaluation. However, she also warned that even if Linda was dealing with psychological issues, the criminal behavior couldn't be ignored. The evidence was too clear and the violation of Margaret's safety too serious. While waiting for the police to take action, James made a decision that surprised both Margaret and Detective Williams. He decided to try calling Linda directly. Despite the detective's initial concerns about interfering with the investigation, James convinced her that a phone conversation might provide valuable insight into Linda's mental state and motivations. The call, which Detective Williams monitored and recorded, revealed the extent of Linda's psychological deterioration. When James reached her, Linda initially seemed almost relieved to hear from him. But when he mentioned Margaret and the trespassing incidents, Her tone changed dramatically. Linda began speaking rapidly and incoherently about how Margaret represented everything that was wrong with James's life. She claimed that Margaret was living the life that should have been hers, peaceful, beautiful, surrounded by growing things. In Linda's distorted perception, Margaret had somehow stolen not just James's attention but the very essence of the happiness Linda felt she deserved. Most disturbing was Linda's admission that she had been borrowing things from Margaret's garden and home because they made her feel connected to the life she wanted. The herbs she took were used in cooking meals she imagined, sharing with James. The flowers were arranged in her apartment as decorations for a home she fantasized they might have together. Linda also revealed that she had been inside Margaret's house multiple times, not just on the night Margaret discovered her door ajar. She described details about Margaret's kitchen, living room, and even her bedroom that could only have been observed through extensive unauthorized entry. She spoke about these intrusions as if they were friendly visits, showing a complete disconnection from the reality of her criminal behavior. The phone call convinced Detective Williams that Linda needed immediate mental health intervention. Her delusions were not only putting Margaret at risk, but were likely to escalate if left untreated. The detective expedited the warrant process and coordinated with Linda's local authorities to ensure she would be arrested and evaluated as quickly as possible. James ended the call feeling shaken and guilty. He realized that his failure to take Linda's earlier erratic behavior seriously had put Margaret in danger. If he had sought help for Linda months ago when her phone calls became concerning, or if he had warned Margaret about his ex-wife's instability, the situation might never have reached this point. Margaret, meanwhile, was grappling with the knowledge that her home had been repeatedly violated by someone who saw her as a symbol rather than a person. The items Linda had taken weren't valuable in monetary terms, but knowing they had been used to fuel elaborate fantasies made Margaret feel deeply unsettled about her own sense of safety and privacy. As they awaited word from the police about Linda's arrest, both James and Margaret wondered whether this revelation would be enough to end the ordeal, or if Linda's obsession had grown too deep to be easily resolved. The arrest of Linda Morrison took place early on a Tuesday morning at her apartment complex, 48 miles away from Margaret's quiet neighborhood. According to Detective Williams, Linda didn't resist when officers arrived with the warrant, but her behavior during the arrest raised serious concerns about her mental state. When officers searched Linda's one-bedroom apartment, they discovered what could only be described as a shrine to the life she believed she should have been living. The small space was filled with items taken from Margaret's property, garden tools arranged on makeshift shelves, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and dozens of photographs Linda had apparently taken during her nocturnal visits to Margaret's home. Most disturbing was a detailed journal Linda had been keeping for over 6 months. The entries revealed that her obsession with Margaret had begun long before the trespassing incidents. She had been driving to the neighborhood regularly, parking several blocks away and walking through the abandoned lot to observe Margaret's daily routines. The journal contained detailed notes about Margaret's gardening schedule, the times she left and returned home, and even descriptions of what she wore on different days. Detective Williams shared some of the less disturbing journal entries with James and Margaret, hoping to help them understand the scope of Linda's fixation. The entries showed a woman living increasingly in a fantasy world where she believed Margaret's life was somehow meant to be hers. Linda wrote about feeling called to the garden, describing Margaret's flowers and vegetables as if they were growing specifically for her benefit. The journal also revealed Linda's elaborate justifications for her behavior. She convinced herself that she was helping Margaret by tidying up the garden and protecting the house when Margaret was away. In her distorted thinking, the items she took were gifts that Margaret had left for her, signs of an imaginary friendship between them. Perhaps most chilling were the entries describing Linda's time inside Margaret's home. She wrote about sitting in Margaret's kitchen, imagining conversations they might have. She described going through Margaret's belongings not to steal but to understand the person she had built up in her mind. Linda had even cooked meals in Margaret's kitchen, carefully cleaning up afterward so her presence wouldn't be detected. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court confirmed what Detective Williams had suspected. Linda was diagnosed with severe depression, complicated by delusional thinking and obsessive-compulsive behaviors. The psychiatrist explained that Linda's divorce from James had triggered a psychological break that led her to fixate on Margaret as a representation of stability and happiness she felt she had lost. For Margaret, learning about the extent of Linda's intrusions was deeply traumatic. Knowing that a stranger had been living a fantasy life in her home, using her belongings and watching her daily routines made her feel violated in ways she struggled to articulate. She found herself questioning every aspect of her environment, wondering what else Linda might have touched or moved without her knowledge. James was grappling with his own feelings of guilt and responsibility. The psychiatrist's report made it clear that Linda's mental health had been deteriorating for months before their divorce was finalized. James realized he had missed or ignored warning signs that might have led to earlier intervention and prevented Margaret from becoming a victim. The legal proceedings moved forward despite Linda's mental health issues. While the court recognized that she needed treatment, the extensive evidence of criminal behavior meant she would face charges for trespassing, burglary, and stalking. The prosecutor worked with mental health advocates to ensure Linda would receive appropriate treatment as part of any sentence. During this time, Margaret made a difficult decision about her living situation. Despite loving her home and garden, she no longer felt safe there. Every shadow seemed threatening, and she found herself constantly checking locks and looking over her shoulder. She decided to stay with her sister in a nearby town, while considering whether to sell her house or find ways to feel secure there again. James offered to maintain Margaret's garden while she was away, feeling it was the least he could do given his role in bringing this situation into her life. As he watered her plants and tended to the flower beds Linda had repeatedly disturbed, he reflected on how quickly a peaceful neighborhood had been transformed into a place of fear and suspicion. The community response to the situation was mixed. Some neighbors expressed sympathy for both Margaret and Linda, recognizing that mental illness had played a significant role in the crimes. Others were frightened by the revelation that someone had been regularly moving through the neighborhood undetected for months, raising questions about everyone's safety. Detective Williams used the case as an opportunity to educate the community about recognizing signs of stalking and obsessive behavior. She pointed out that Linda's escalating pattern of intrusion was typical of cases where mental health issues intersect with criminal behavior, and she encouraged residents to report suspicious activities even when they seemed minor. As the court date approached, both James and Margaret were asked to provide victim impact statements describing how Linda's actions had affected their lives. For Margaret, writing the statement forced her to confront the full scope of how the experience had changed her relationship with her own home and sense of security. The case also raised broader questions about how communities and law enforcement should respond when criminal behavior appears to be driven by untreated mental illness. While everyone involved wanted Linda to receive appropriate help, they also recognized that Margaret's right to safety and security in her own home had to be protected. Linda remained in custody pending trial, receiving treatment for her psychological condition, while the legal system worked to balance the needs of public safety with appropriate care for someone clearly struggling with serious mental health issues. 3 weeks before Linda's scheduled court appearance, an unexpected development changed everything about the case. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the psychiatrist treating Linda while she remained in custody, requested an emergency meeting with Detective Williams, the prosecutor, and Linda's defense attorney. During the meeting, Dr. Martinez revealed that Linda's condition was more complex than initially diagnosed. While receiving treatment, Linda had begun exhibiting symptoms that suggested she might be suffering from a rare form of dissociative disorder, in addition to her depression and delusional thinking. Under careful therapeutic guidance, Linda had started to remember details about her past that painted her recent behavior in a completely different light. The breakthrough came when Linda began describing childhood memories that had been suppressed for years. She remembered living in a house very similar to Margaret's when she was 8 years old, before her family was forced to move due to financial difficulties. That house had represented the last time Linda felt truly safe and happy, before a series of family traumas that included her father's abandonment and her mother's subsequent mental health struggles. Dr. Martinez explained that Linda's obsession with Margaret's home wasn't just about her divorce from James or simple jealousy. In her psychologically fragmented state, Margaret's house had triggered powerful memories of the childhood home she had lost. The garden, the layout of the property, even the way Margaret maintained her surroundings all echoed the safe haven Linda had been forced to leave decades earlier. This revelation didn't excuse Linda's criminal behavior, but it provided crucial context for understanding why she had fixated so specifically on Margaret and her property. In Linda's mind, she wasn't invading a stranger's home. She was trying to return to a place that represented security and happiness from her past. The psychiatric evaluation also revealed that Linda had been experiencing what Dr. Martinez called fugue episodes, periods of altered consciousness, during which she would drive to Margaret's neighborhood without fully understanding why. During these episodes, Linda felt compelled to visit the property, often with little memory of how she had gotten there or what she intended to do. Armed with this new information, Linda's defense attorney requested a competency hearing to determine whether she was mentally fit to stand trial. The prosecutor, while sympathetic to Linda's psychological condition, maintained that the extensive evidence of criminal behavior and the impact on Margaret couldn't be ignored, regardless of the underlying mental health issues. Margaret learned about these developments during a meeting with Detective Williams and the victim's advocate assigned to her case. Hearing about Linda's childhood trauma evoked conflicting emotions, sympathy for what Linda had endured, but also frustration that her own victimization was being overshadowed by discussions of Linda's mental state. Margaret's victim impact statement, which she had spent weeks preparing, took on new significance in light of Linda's psychiatric evaluation. She described not just the immediate effects of the trespassing and burglary, but the long-term impact on her sense of security and her relationship with her own home. "I understand that Linda may have been suffering from serious mental health problems," Margaret wrote, "but understanding her condition doesn't erase the fear I felt when I realized someone had been in my house, touching my belongings, watching my daily routines. I'm 62 years old and I've never felt unsafe in my own home until now. Whether Linda intended to frighten me or not, the result is the same. I've lost something I can never fully get back." James also struggled with the new information about Linda's condition. While it helped explain her behavior in ways that reduced his feelings of guilt about their failed marriage, it also complicated his emotions about the situation. He found himself feeling genuinely sorry for Linda while still being angry about what she had put Margaret through. The competency hearing took place in a small courtroom, with only the necessary legal parties present. Dr. Martinez testified about Linda's mental state, explaining that while she understood the charges against her and could participate in her defense, her judgment remained impaired by her underlying psychological conditions. Linda herself appeared frail and confused during the hearing. When asked directly by the judge whether she understood that entering Margaret's property without permission was wrong, she responded that she knew it was illegal but still felt like she had been called to the house in ways she couldn't explain or control. The judge ultimately ruled that Linda was competent to stand trial but recommended that her case be handled through the mental health court system, which would allow for a sentence that prioritized treatment while still holding her accountable for her criminal actions. As part of the plea negotiations, Linda's attorney proposed a sentence that would include residential mental health treatment, supervised probation, and a restraining order that would prohibit her from entering Margaret's neighborhood or contacting either Margaret or James. Linda would also be required to pay restitution for the items she had taken and for the security measures Margaret had been forced to install. Margaret found herself in the difficult position of deciding whether to support this approach or push for a traditional criminal sentence. The victim's advocate explained that the mental health court option might actually provide better long-term protection by addressing the root causes of Linda's behavior, but Margaret worried that it sent the message that mental illness could be used as an excuse for criminal behavior. During this time, Margaret made another important decision. She chose to return to her home rather than selling it and moving away. With James's help, she had installed additional security measures and had begun working with a therapist to process her own trauma from the experience. She was determined not to let Linda's actions force her away from the life she had built. The resolution of Linda's case would ultimately depend on whether the court system could balance the competing needs of public safety, victims' rights, and appropriate treatment for someone whose criminal behavior was clearly intertwined with serious mental illness. The mental health court hearing took place on a gray December morning, exactly 4 months after James had first captured Linda on his security cameras. The courtroom was smaller and less formal than a traditional criminal court, designed to foster therapeutic, rather than purely punitive outcomes. Margaret sat in the front row, having decided to attend despite her attorney's advice that it wasn't necessary. Linda appeared dramatically different from the confused, disheveled woman who had been arrested months earlier. 3 months of intensive psychiatric treatment had stabilized her condition significantly. She was clean, appropriately dressed, and appeared to understand the gravity of her situation. When called upon to address the court, she spoke clearly and directly to Margaret. "Mrs. Chen, I know that nothing I say can undo the fear and violation I caused you," Linda began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I understand now that my actions weren't just illegal, they were cruel and terrifying for you. I wasn't thinking clearly about how my presence in your home and garden would affect you. I was lost in my own pain and confusion, but that's no excuse for what I put you through." Linda went on to explain what she had learned about herself during treatment. The therapy had helped her understand how her childhood trauma and subsequent mental health struggles had created the psychological conditions that led to her obsession with Margaret's property. She acknowledged that while these factors explained her behavior, they didn't excuse the real harm she had caused. Dr. Martinez testified about Linda's progress in treatment and her prognosis for recovery. The psychiatrist explained that Linda's dissociative episodes had been successfully managed with medication, and that extensive therapy had helped her develop healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with stress and trauma triggers. However, she emphasized that Linda would need ongoing mental health support to prevent a recurrence of her obsessive behaviors. The judge, who specialized in cases involving mental health issues, asked probing questions about Linda's understanding of the impact of her actions and her commitment to following court-ordered treatment. Linda's responses demonstrated genuine remorse and a clear grasp of why her behavior had been harmful, even when she hadn't intended to cause fear or distress. Margaret was given the opportunity to address the court directly. She had prepared remarks that balanced her desire for justice with recognition of Linda's mental health struggles. "I want Linda to get the help she needs," Margaret said, "but I also want to feel safe in my own home again. For months I lived in fear because someone was watching me, taking my belongings and entering my house without permission. That fear doesn't just disappear because I now understand why it happened." The judge ultimately accepted a plea agreement that reflected the complex nature of the case. Linda pleaded guilty to charges of trespassing, burglary, and stalking, but would serve her sentence through the mental health court system. She was sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation, with the first year to be served in a residential mental health facility that specialized in treating individuals with trauma-related disorders. As part of her sentence, Linda was prohibited from entering Margaret's neighborhood or having any contact with either Margaret or James. She was required to continue psychiatric treatment for the duration of her probation and to pay restitution covering the items she had taken, Margaret's security system installation, and counseling costs. The judge also ordered Linda to write a detailed letter to Margaret explaining exactly what items she had taken and what she had done during her unauthorized entries into Margaret's home. This information would help Margaret understand the full scope of the intrusions and might provide closure by eliminating the uncertainty about what had happened during those violations of her privacy. In the months following the sentencing, Margaret worked to rebuild her sense of security and normalcy. She continued therapy to address the trauma of having her home repeatedly invaded, and gradually began to feel comfortable in her garden again. The herbs and flowers Linda had taken were replanted, and Margaret found a certain satisfaction in nurturing new growth in the spaces that had been disturbed. James remained a supportive neighbor, though their relationship had inevitably been changed by the events. He provided updates about the security system and occasionally helped with garden maintenance. But both he and Margaret understood that his connection to Linda would always be part of their shared history. Detective Williams used the case in training sessions for other officers, highlighting how mental health issues could manifest in criminal behavior, and emphasizing the importance of balancing public safety with appropriate treatment. The case became an example of how the criminal justice system could address complex situations involving mental illness while still protecting victims' rights. Linda completed her residential treatment program successfully and transitioned to outpatient care while living in a supervised community setting in another state. She sent periodic updates to the court as required by her probation terms, demonstrating continued stability and engagement with treatment. Her psychiatrist reported that she had developed healthy relationships with other residents and was working part-time in a community garden program that channeled her love of growing things in positive directions. For Margaret, the resolution provided a measure of justice and closure. Though she knew the experience had permanently changed her, she had learned to be more cautious about security while refusing to let fear dominate her life. Her garden flourished that spring, more beautiful than ever, representing not just her resilience, but her determination to reclaim the peace that had been temporarily stolen from her. The case ultimately demonstrated how criminal behavior, rooted in mental illness, could be addressed through treatment and accountability, while still recognizing the real harm caused to victims. Though the situation had been frightening and disruptive, it also showed how communities could respond with both compassion and justice when faced with complex human problems that didn't fit neatly into traditional categories of right and wrong.